I'm Peggy Pico. Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, the U.S. Supreme Court rules human genes cannot be patented. We'll explain how the decision could impact San Diego's biotech industry.
In the early 70s, I first came down in 1971. There was a tremendous amount of sand. We used to have sand out in front of our home.
San Diego beaches are slowly shrinking. We'll slide into the debate over how to deal with the eroding shorelines. Plus, an anarchist group takes on corporate worlds in a new indie film opening in San Diego this week.
KPBS Evening Edition is made possible by Joan and Erwin Jacobs and by
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Today, the Supreme Court struck down patents on naturally occurring human genes. That's good news for women wanting to get tested for the risk of breast and ovarian cancer. A company called Myriad Genetics no longer owns the gene these tests look for. And just hours after the court's unanimous decision came through, rival companies stepped in to offer the test at much lower cost. But what does this mean for San Diego's biotech industry? KPBS science and technology reporter David Wagner joins us to talk about the local companies who may be affected by this decision. And David, patients and academic researchers are cheering today's decision, but what are local biotech professionals saying?
Well, they're not surprised. Earlier today, I spoke with Joe Panetta, president of the local biotech trade group Biocom. And he says everyone he's spoken with pretty much expected the Supreme Court to invalidate these gene patents. They're actually somewhat happy with the ruling because even though the court struck down patents on genes made by nature, they also upheld patents on gene-related technology.
But this certainly doesn't mean that the decision today won't affect local biotech industries and companies.
Oh, it definitely will affect some biotech companies here in San Diego. Particularly companies like Isis Pharmaceuticals and Life Technologies. They're two of the country's top gene patent holders. The University of California also holds hundreds of gene patents, including the very first one ever approved. It gave them the right to a specific human growth hormone. If these patents were brought before a court today, there's now a strong precedent for invalidating them.
All right, KPBS science and technology reporter David Wagner, thank you for the update. And the Supreme Court also overturned part of the anti-smog program at the Port of Los Angeles. In 2008, the port enacted a program to restrict the types of trucks carrying goods in and out of its terminals. It was designed to curb pollution at the nation's largest port, but justices voted unanimously today to strike down parts of the program. One provision required companies to develop an off-street parking plan. Another made them display "How am I driving" signs on their trucks. The High Court ruled, though, that those two provisions are preempted by federal law. Since the late 1980s, a California mandate to reduce black carbon emissions, mostly from diesel engines, has measurably decreased air pollutants. Now, the first of its kind study reveals the impact of that on California's climate. Led by researcher Ram Ramanathan, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric and Climate Sciences at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. Professor Ramanathan, thanks so much for coming back and joining us. Tell us what is black carbon and where does it come from?
It's basically the dark stuff you see coming out of diesel trucks or when you have major forest fires. The smoke, we used to call them soot, and a major component of that soot is black carbon.
It's black carbon. Now, that's different than we're looking at some video of like some trains that put that out or diesel trucks on a track. How is that different from CO2?
Carbon dioxide, that's a good question. Black carbon is a particle. That's why you see it. Whereas carbon dioxide is a gas. It's colorless.
Okay.
So that's the difference between carbon dioxide on the one hand and black carbon on the other.
Yeah, we just saw this black soot covering a snow-covered outlet on top of some train or truck.
Right.
How were you able to measure carbon reduction? So these mandates were in place and they seem to be working. How can you measure that?
It was totally a surprising result for us. this is a 3-year-long study. What we were looking for was what is this black carbon doing to present-day climate in California? When we are looking at all the records, we found this massive decrease in the black carbon concentration. It decreased by 50% in the last 20 years. And then we went back to 1960s, it had decreased by 90%.
So clearly these mandates are working, these changes are working, and we'll get to that in more detail. But you're talking specifically in California. How does that impact our climate?
Yes. Black carbon, independent of the study, we have discovered that black carbon is the second largest source of global warming, next to carbon dioxide. And diesel combustion particularly is the major contributor. And just to give you an example of how large is this finding, we found that the reduction we saw over the last 20 years is equivalent to pulling out 21 million tons of carbon dioxide every year.
Which works out to about 4 million cars, if I did the math right?
Yes.
4 million cars in California off the roads. The entire city of San Diego not emitting this soot, this black soot.
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, right. Okay. So
that was because carbon dioxide is a big gorilla. We're just converting the reduction in black carbon, the climate mitigation effect it has had, and what would have taken for carbon dioxide to do that, that's equivalent to pulling out 4 million cars.
If you had to put it in a very succinct, and I hate to do this for you, way, what is it about the last few years and this mandate and reducing the diesel emissions that impacted these pollutants? Was it better machinery, better cars? What was it? What's the key?
It's a combination of two things. First, changing the fuel using low sulfur diesel, and then changing the engine design, and then the third part is putting filters. These are basically traps black carbon.
How would you like to see your data used here in the U.S. and globally, of course, because we're not just talking about climate change in California. There's climate change going on around the world.
Excellent. Thank you. The key thing is California has been a pioneer in this. If the California example can be replicated elsewhere in the U.S. and the world as a planet as a whole, we can slow down global warming by as much as 15%. So that's how huge it is.
So we can actually have an impact. It's not doom and gloom as a lot of people think. Our behavior can change the speed at which we're warming.
One other thing I want to add there is we will see it in our lifetime. That is the beauty of the soot. It stays in the air only for 2 weeks. You get rid of the emission today, they are gone 2 weeks from now.
All right, something we can actually work on and see. And I want to let folks know that they can see your whole report and findings on our website, kpbs.org. Distinguished Professor Ramanathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And it's official. Southern California Edison has taken the first step to begin the decommissioning process of the San Onofre nuclear power plant. The utility says it has officially filed the necessary paperwork with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Last week, Edison announced it would permanently shutter the plant, which had been sitting idle since January 2012 due to equipment problems. There may soon be a second city in San Diego County that bans plastic shopping bags. An online petition is asking the Oceanside City Council to ban the plastic bags. More than 500 signatures have been collected so far. Solana Beach implemented its plastic bag ban last year. A state ban failed in the legislature earlier this year. New census data shows the number of multiracial people in the U.S. has grown significantly in the last 2 years and continues to grow. Adrian Florido joins me from the News Center with more. And Adrian, how does the census define multiracial, and how many people in the U.S. identify that way?
Well, the census defines it as anyone who identifies as more than one race on the census form or in surveys that the census conducts every year. Last year, there were about 7.5 million people in the U.S. recorded as multiracial. Now, in and of itself, that number only represents about 2.5% of the entire population of the country. But what's interesting is that the rate of growth of that number since 2010 is 4 times faster than the rate of growth of the population of the country as a whole. So clearly, the multiracial population in the U.S. is growing pretty quickly.
How do researchers explain this growth?
There are a number of reasons. I mean, the main one that researchers primarily identify is this growing acceptance with interracial marriage in the U.S. Pew did a study a couple of years ago and found that in 2008, 1 in 7 of all marriages in the U.S. were between people of different races or ethnicities, and that reflects a changing attitude towards interracial marriage overall. The same study found that 60% of all Americans said that they would be okay if someone in their family told them that they were going to marry someone of a different race or ethnicity, which represents a pretty big shift over previous decades.
All right, Frontiers reporter Adrian Florido, thanks for the update. A quiet crisis is occurring along San Diego's shoreline. The beaches are being literally washed away. Some homeowners have built seawalls to protect the eroding bluffs, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is working on the most ambitious sand replenishment project yet, proposed for the West Coast. KPBS North County Bureau Chief Allison St. John says Solana Beach and Encinitas are key players in the debate over how to deal with the eroding shorelines and sea level rise.
Down at Moonlight Beach in Encinitas, Charlie Marvin reminisces about how it was when he first came to live on the bluffs above the beach.
When I first got here in the early 70s, I first came down in 1971, there was a tremendous amount of sand. We used to have sand out in front of our home basically from about May until October, where we'd set up a beach volleyball court, like the courts you see over there, flat, heavy sand.
But 10 years later, things changed.
And in 1982, 83, I think it was, we had the El Niños. The first really bad El Niños. We had 2 huge storms that took away a lot of the bluff.
Beaches in North County have been getting narrower and stonier. The only reason Moonlight Beach looks so sandy is because tons of sand were brought in to replenish it earlier this spring.
If you don't replenish it, we will not have beaches.
A few miles south in Fletcher Cove, Solana Beach City Manager David Ott explains why beaches are shrinking.
That's because of dams up our rivers, jetties on our oceans, parking lots that cover all the sand flow into them. So there's really not a natural resupply of sand. So as the waves crash in, they take the sand out and eventually take all the sand out.
Ott says Solana Beach has almost 2 miles of 80-foot bluffs, mostly made of rapidly eroding sandstone. He says boulders the size of Volkswagens have rolled onto the beach without any notice.
We've been very fortunate in Solana Beach that so far nobody has died. However, in Encinitas, somebody died several years ago just sitting on the beach watching their husband surf.
Private homeowners who could afford it have spent millions building seawalls to protect their properties. But Solana Beach has recently passed a new coastal land use plan that introduces a time limit on seawalls.
In the approved plan, the permit will be issued for 20 years and then be reevaluated for any changed conditions after those 20 years.
Some private property owners have sued over this 20-year time limit, which was introduced by the California Coastal Commission. In the long term, the Commission advocates a more realistic approach, moving property back from the cliffs, a strategy called managed retreat. But Encinitas attorney John Kahn sued the Coastal Commission and won earlier this year as he defended his client's right to replace a collapsed seawall and stairs.
They try to soft pedal it like, oh, well, it's just so we can reassess it in 20 years. But in my opinion, and obviously in the judge's opinion, that's not the case. This is a plan to basically try to prevent people from having seawalls after a certain amount of time and to deploy this idea of managed retreat, which hasn't really gone through the democratic process.
The days of shoring up the cliffs with seawalls like these may be numbered, in which case Plan B is replenishing the beach with millions and millions of tons of sand.
The Army Corps of Engineers will complete a study later this month on a plan to replenish beaches in Solana Beach and Encinitas over the next 50 years. It would start by spreading more than 1 million cubic yards of sand, more than 7 times more sand than in recent replenishment projects. One man who has his doubts about how dredging this much sand will affect marine life in Encinitas is marine biologist Dennis Lees.
You know, I'm not opposed to putting sand on the beach. My opposition relates to how much sand they're talking about digging up offshore.
Lees says he's found shells in the sand already deposited on the beach that show decades-old shellfish scooped up, animals that he says are an important part of the fishery's food chain.
They're very shiny inside. This is the coating I'm talking about here, which is what they call periostracum. That grows on the outside of the shell. So this guy was alive. It's going to take what was the best and most productive areas and turn it into dead zones for in excess of 50 years.
Approval of the sand replenishment project may be fast-tracked. David Ott hopes the Army Corps and the Coastal Commission sign off on it later this summer.
Because there's probably no better poster child for a sand replenishment project in California than here in Solana Beach. And if we can't be successful here, it probably causes challenges for the rest of the state that may need some projects as well.
Even if the sand replenishment project is approved, there's the matter of cost, which Ott estimates is about $70 million over 50 years. He hopes federal and state budgets will foot most of that bill, but there's no telling whether shrinking budgets and the growing threat of sea level rise will make preserving our beaches and bluffs an increasingly difficult proposition. Alison St. John, KPBS News.
This coming Saturday, you can get a behind-the-scenes look at how your food, flowers, and wine grapes grow on the 4th annual Farm Tour Day in North County, put on by the San Diego County Farm Bureau. Here with more on the walking tours are Al Staley, Grove Manager at Rockwood Ranch, and Lindsay Hogue with the Farm Bureau. Welcome.
Thanks.
Lindsay, let's start with you. What happens on this farm tour?
The format of the day is that you get a starting farm, and you first choose a tour, so either Valley Center, Fallbrook, or San Pasqual Valley. And on that tour, you'll get to see 4 or 5 farms, and you can go to all the farms in whatever order you want, and you have every 30 minutes. The farmers themselves will take you on a tour of what they do, why they do it, and how everything's growing.
Give us some examples. There's a lot of variety. What sort of things? I think I saw a picture of people riding on a wagon and seeing goats. What kind of farms are we going to see here?
We do have a couple wagon tours. We've got one at Conine Dairy in San Pasqual Valley. That's a fully operational dairy. We also have a huge greenhouse operation in Fallbrook, and we've got flowers growing, we've got vegetables, we've got orchards, we've got wine grapes. We've kind of got it all. And each of the tours has a really good sample of what's going on in San Diego agriculture.
Flowers, food, citrus, and
right, avocados.
Big stuff. Well, Al, now, your family has been in the farming industry for 3 generations, I think you've said.
Correct.
Farms aren't normally open to the public. Tell us about your farm, how big it is, the ranch.
It's a ranch I manage. I also have my own on the other side of Valley Center, but this time we're featuring a ranch I manage. It's got 100 acres of citrus, 8 acres of grapes, and about 60 acres of avocados. And we're going to try and show people a little bit of each with time constraints available. So.
It's a great big farm. Why do you like having this farm tour? Why do you like having the people come through?
We get great questions, and it's a chance for us, the farmers, to interact with people one-on-one, explain to them what we do. We hear their questions, their concerns, and we walk away with a better understanding of what people's concerns and issues are, and they walk away with a really good idea of what our concerns and issues are. So it's a really good meeting place.
Kind of a learning experience
for both.
On both sides.
Yes.
Lindsay, what do you think surprises people most when they go on this tour?
I think people are surprised that farming exists in the capacity that it does. The vastness, the scope of agriculture in San Diego, people
more than 5,000, right? More than 5,000 farms.
Right. There's more small farms in San Diego County than any other county in the country. And we have a lot of farms, and we've got a lot of stuff that's growing, a lot of stuff that you drive past that you don't even necessarily think of as a farm or a crop. You don't notice that those trees that are on the side of the 15 are actually the avocados that are going to end up in your store and then in your cupboard.
And throughout the nation when it comes to avocados.
Right.
Now, Al, Aside from your farm
Yes.
and the Rockwood Ranch, which farm would you want to visit, or which one would you recommend visiting?
Well, I help pick them out, so I would love to go to all of them. And I guess if I've recommended, a couple of my friends have called me, I would recommend the Fallbrook tour because Tony Godfrey's Olive Hill Greenhouse is on that tour. You walk into this building, nondescript, whitewashed greenhouse, and you open the door into this beautiful view of acres and acres of magnificent, colorful bromeliads, and it just takes your breath away.
And something about that greenhouse is he uses reverse osmosis to increase the water quality, which has come up on these farm tours, right? And Alan, wanted to ask you this. Some people say, San Diego, we've got these 5,000 farms. We're having drought problems. It's costly to have water. Should we have farms here? How do you respond to that, to people who ask you?
Well, as long as there's water available and we can harvest enough crops to pay for the water, we'll be here because the weather is so good in San Diego County for farming. So that's why we're here. Myself, I'm adjusting my farm. We're taking out avocados that are marginal producers and putting in wine grapes because they use so much less water.
All right. Well, I definitely want to thank you both for coming and giving us a little sneak preview of what can happen this weekend. And I also want to let folks know that there are still a limited number of tickets available for these tours. Reservations are strongly recommended. You can find out more about the Farm Tour Day online at kpbs.org. And corporations that refuse to be held accountable for their actions are taken to task by an anarchist group in the new indie film, The East. KPBS arts reporter Beth Accomando speaks with the filmmakers about crafting a story from their own experiences.
Background. Action.
The East is the third film written by and starring Britt Marling. Once again, she teams with director Zalbat Monglich, but this time they draw on their own experiences hitting the road in 2009.
We decided to go explore America, but rather than doing the surface road trip, we decided to go into America's underworld, or what we consider the underworld. So we went to some anarchist farms, we went to direct action collectives, and having an experience that totally opened our eyes and stayed with us. It stayed with us so much that we couldn't really shake it.
So they turned it into a movie. Marling plays a woman who infiltrates an anarchist group known for dispensing its own brand of justice against corrupt or indifferent corporations.
Another corporate figure has been targeted by the eco-activist group The East.
So there are two sides in the movie. There are the anarchists who are committing the eye for an eye justice or direct action, and then there are the corporations. The anarchist collective is imagined, but the corporations are all based on real corporations.
That's what's kind of scary about this thriller, is that it's not, it's not an imagined antagonist. It's real life.
I'm looking for the East tag. I heard the East doesn't exist.
What happens in the East is even what I think happens with a lot of resistance movements. The breakup often happens over the disagreement about how far is too far. The question becomes, how does it work with means to an end? Like, if you harm people, but some greater good or some greater awakening is achieved, is that okay? Some people want to take it a lot farther because they feel an eye for an eye justice means if someone's been harmed, we can harm back to that exact degree. And other people in the group are saying, well, wait a second, if we're doing that kind of damage, aren't we just as bad as the force we're fighting?
The film doesn't offer an answer, but it does pose provocative questions. Beth Accomando, KPBS News.
The East opens tomorrow at Landmark's Hillcrest Cinema and AMC La Jolla. Now here's a look at your weather forecast for tomorrow and Father's Day weekend. It'll be cloudy and cool at the coast over the next couple of days. Inland warmer with temperatures in the upper 70s. In our mountains, sunny and 79 degrees tomorrow. And no surprise here, hot and dry in the desert. Now, it's been kind of a Mission Beach landmark for decades, but outside of that community, it's not well known. But it's one-of-a-kind house with a history of its own about San Diego. Ken Kramer has the story.
In the past on this show, you've heard about these houses on and around Adams Avenue and Normal Heights in Kensington, made of rocks, as you can see. Well, there's one more house we want to show you here, and this one's just a couple of blocks from the beach on Pismo Court. And it was built decades ago by a man named Charles Wright.
Well, Charles Wright was a surfer in San Diego and lived here at the beach. And They had a big flood in 1922.
Very big. The surf came crashing up against shorefront buildings in Mission Beach, tore them apart, and lots of wood went floating out into the water, Philip Prather says.
And Charles Wright went out and collected those building wood to build this house along with the rocks.
Along with the rock. Okay, the wood. He swam out and grabbed it, brought it to shore, and there it is in the house today on the windows and doors. But where'd the rock come from? Had to be from somewhere. Well, Philip Prather, who's an author and historian of Mission Beach, says Charles Wright hauled them here, whatever it took, loaded them into or onto something, and personally brought them a couple of miles from the coast at Bird Rock.
That's a huge one here. I don't know how he possibly even got that put on the buggy or wagon.
Looking back, Charles Wright was one of those people 80 years ago who was bigger than life. He was a lifeguard, had a speedboat. You lived in this beach community back then, you knew Charles Wright. Everybody did.
And he won the first surfing contest, recognized surfing contest ever held in Southern California. And he won it right up here on Redondo Court.
But his most lasting accomplishment is this little house on Pismo Court that still stands today. I don't think anything's going to come along and knock it down. A tribute to his sense of the moment. First, knowing when to go out there and grab what was floating by.
And then going up to Bird Rock for all this. I mean, how many trips did he make?
Philip thinks that Mr. Wright, if he were still around today, would be very proud of his rock house. And I'll bet he's correct about that. You couldn't do it nowadays. Just haul away boulders and stones from a public beach to build your personal cottage. But this is now and that was then, and back then he did it the right way.
It's lasted all these years.
And that's a solid fact about San Diego.
If you'd like to see more of Ken Kramer's stories about San Diego, you can do so tonight and every Thursday night at 8 p.m. right here on KPBS. You can also find tonight's stories and download the KPBS app all on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thanks for joining us and have a great night.